Winter had laid its pale hand upon London, and beneath the towering windows of Ashcombe House, the city glittered like a field of distant, indifferent stars. Within, the grand ballroom breathed warmth and light, chandeliers scattering fractured brilliance across polished marble as if heaven itself had been shattered and carefully reassembled for mortal admiration. Music flowed in disciplined waves, a waltz rehearsed to perfection yet lacking mercy for those who faltered beneath its rhythm. Lady Evelyn Ashcombe stood at the threshold, her gloved fingers resting lightly upon the gilded archway, as though she required permission from the very air to enter. Her gown, a muted ivory threaded with silver embroidery, clung to her form with restrained elegance, the sort of beauty that did not beg to be noticed yet refused to be ignored. Once she had entered rooms like this with laughter at her lips. Tonight she entered as a question no one wished to answer. Whispers found her before gazes did. Society always spoke before it looked. "That is her," murmured a voice behind a fan of peacock feathers. "The Duke's quiet sorrow," replied another, sharpened with amusement. "Or his greatest disappointment," came a third, softer but far crueler for its gentleness. Evelyn did not turn. She had learned that acknowledgment only fed gossip, and silence, though heavy, preserved dignity when dignity itself had begun to fray at the edges. Across the room, Duke Adrian Ravenshire stood beneath the largest chandelier, its crystalline light crowning him in fractured brilliance. He was composed in the manner of men forged by expectation rather than affection, straight-backed, immaculately dressed, and distant even in the presence of celebration. His expression betrayed nothing, yet nothing was what Evelyn had come to expect from him. They had once been strangers bound by contract and lineage. Then, for a fleeting season during their courtship, something like tenderness had lived between them. A shared glance in the library. A quiet laugh behind closed doors. The illusion of warmth, carefully preserved until marriage demanded permanence. Now there was only distance. A violist struck a brighter note, and couples began to swirl across the floor like petals caught in an unfeeling wind. Evelyn stepped forward when etiquette required it, accepting the attention of passing acquaintances with practiced grace. Yet every step felt heavier than the last, as though the very house was aware of her fragility. It was then that she heard her name again, not in admiration but in judgment. "They say the Duke avoids her company entirely. Can a marriage survive when silence is its only language?" Evelyn's fingers tightened slightly around her fan, but her expression remained composed. She had mastered the art of stillness, the performance of endurance that noble women were taught as early as childhood. Yet beneath that stillness, something delicate and unspoken trembled. The orchestra faltered briefly as doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. A shift passed through the crowd like wind through tall grass. Duke Adrian Ravenshire had arrived late. He entered without haste, his presence cutting through conversation rather than joining it. There was no apology in his posture, no acknowledgement of delay. Only control. Heads turned instinctively, drawn to him as iron to a hidden magnet. And yet, when his gaze swept the room, it did not land on his wife. It landed elsewhere first. A woman in deep burgundy silk laughed at something he said as he approached her, her hand resting lightly upon his sleeve. The gesture was brief, socially acceptable, and yet it struck Evelyn with a precision no blade could match. A polite smile formed on Evelyn's lips, though she did not feel it. It was a mask carefully placed, carefully held. The Duke danced once before he spoke to her. Once before he acknowledged her existence in a room filled with hundreds. When at last he approached, his voice was measured, quiet, and utterly unreadable. "You are well?" he asked, as though asking after weather rather than absence. "I am, as one might expect," Evelyn replied softly. A pause lingered between them, filled only by music and watching eyes. "You should not stand alone so long," he said at last. "I have grown accustomed to it," she answered. Something flickered in his expression, too brief to name. Before he could respond further, a gentleman requested her hand for the next dance, and custom demanded acceptance. Evelyn moved away, guided by practiced steps, while Adrian remained where he was, already turning his attention elsewhere. Only later did she find herself drawn away from the ballroom's brilliance, retreating through corridors lined with ancestral portraits whose painted eyes seemed to follow her like silent judges. The library awaited at the end of the passage, its door slightly ajar, exhaling the familiar scent of aged paper and forgotten evenings. It had once been their shared refuge. Now it felt like a memory that did not belong to her alone. Voices drifted from within. Evelyn halted. She should have turned away. She did not. And then she heard him speak, her husband's voice stripped of ceremony, unguarded in a way she had not heard in years. "I should never have married Evelyn Ashcombe." The words did not echo. They settled. Like something breaking quietly, irreversibly, behind closed doors that had never truly been locked. Evelyn stood motionless as laughter and music continued beyond the walls, unaware that a life had just been rewritten in 7 words and one silent witness who could no longer pretend she had not heard. Her breath caught, but she did not cry. Instead, she turned toward the corridor with measured steps, each one heavier than the last, while behind her, the library door remained slightly open as if waiting for her return that she now knew would never come the same again. Behind her, the faint sound of the library door closing too slowly suggested that someone inside had finally realized she was there, and was too late to stop the truth. London awoke beneath a sky of bruised pearl after the scandal of Ashcombe House spread through drawing rooms and breakfast tables like spilled ink. Servants whispered while polishing silver and polishing tongues in equal measure. At Ravenshire Manor, Lady Evelyn Ashcombe remained within her chambers where dawn light fell through frost-veined windows like reluctant forgiveness. She had not slept since hearing her husband's words behind the library door. 7 words that had rewritten everything. The Duchess who had once believed in love now understood its silence. Below in the dining hall, letters and invitations arrived like obedient birds. The Duke sent no apology that morning, only a box lined with midnight velvet containing a sapphire bracelet that caught the light like frozen grief. The messenger bowed too deeply as though ashamed of bearing something too beautiful to be forgiven. Evelyn did not touch the box at first. Instead, she watched it as one might watch a memory that refused to die. When she finally opened it, the bracelet lay coiled like captured moonlight. Inside was a note written in Adrian's steady hand. "Some wounds are inflicted by cowardice rather than cruelty." She read it twice, then folded it carefully as though it might cut her if mishandled, and placed both bracelet and note back into the velvet darkness without a word. That evening London glittered again as though nothing had broken. The Winterbourne dinner was held in a hall draped with gold leaf and expectation. Evelyn arrived alone in a carriage that felt too large for her solitude. Whispers followed her again, sharper now, more curious than cruel. They had heard of the bracelet returned untouched. They had heard of silence between Duke and Duchess. Adrian stood at the far end of the room like a man carved from restraint. When his eyes finally met hers, there was no warmth, only calculation. A noble woman leaned close to whisper something that made Adrian briefly smile without joy. Evelyn felt that smile more sharply than any insult. The dinner began with forced elegance and brittle conversation. Midway through the courses, a deliberate silence fell when Lady Montrose raised her glass. "I wonder," she said softly, "whether a marriage built on absence can truly survive presence." A ripple moved through the table like wind over ice. Evelyn set down her fork with perfect calm. "I believe," she replied, "that even absence can be endured when truth remains intact." Adrian's voice cut through the table like tempered steel. "Enough." The room stilled. He stood slowly and for the first time that evening addressed not the table but his wife. "Any insult directed toward Lady Ravenshire is directed toward me." The words were not tender but absolute. Evelyn's breath caught despite herself. For a moment Adrian looked at her as though remembering something he had buried. Then just as quickly the distance returned. After the dinner, Evelyn stepped into the corridor where candlelight trembled on painted walls. Adrian followed but did not speak at first. "You returned the bracelet," he said finally. "I returned what I could not wear," she answered. A pause stretched between them, heavy as winter. Adrian lowered his voice. "You did not hear all that was said in the library." "I heard enough," she said quickly. "No," he said firmly, "you heard the ending without the reason." Evelyn turned away, but he reached not to touch her, only to stop her leaving. "Because I am afraid of becoming my father." The confession hung in the air like smoke. Before she could respond, a servant appeared, pale and breathless. "My lady, a letter has arrived for the Duke." Evelyn watched as Adrian took the sealed envelope. The wax bore a crest she did not recognize. His expression changed for the first time that night. Not anger, not sorrow, but fear. "What is it?" Evelyn asked. Adrian did not answer immediately. Instead, he broke the seal. The letter revealed a name from his past that neither of them had spoken aloud in years. Evelyn stepped closer despite herself. Adrian's hand tightened around the paper. "This cannot be," he whispered. Outside, thunder rolled across the city. The same storm that had once marked the beginning of their silence. Evelyn felt the air in the corridor grow impossibly still because she already knew this name would change everything. Adrian looked up slowly, and in that instant Evelyn understood the library had not been the beginning of their ending, it had been only the first crack. The corridor seemed to narrow around them. Adrian folded the letter with shaking precision. "That man," he said quietly, "is not meant to return." Evelyn felt her pulse rise sharply. Then who is he, she asked. Adrian hesitated long enough for the silence to become unbearable. My father did not act alone, he said. The revelation struck harder than any accusation. Evelyn stepped back into the candlelight as though it might fail her, and for the first time she saw her husband not as a man of power but as a man standing at the edge of ruin. Outside the library door a second knock echoed, slower, heavier, deliberate, not from a servant but from someone who already knew the answer. Evelyn looked at the door. Adrian did not move. The knock came again. And this time the voice outside called his name, a name that made the color drain from his face. Evelyn whispered, "Who is that?" Adrian closed his eyes once, then answered in a voice she had never heard before. "The past," he said, "has found us." The door handle turned slowly without invitation. Evelyn stepped back instinctively. Adrian moved in front of her as if shielding her from a memory that had finally taken form. The door opened and the corridor beyond seemed darker than before. A figure stood in the threshold, soaked by rain, his presence unmistakably tied to everything Adrian had tried to bury forever. Evelyn held her breath as the truth finally stepped into the light and did not. The rain had begun before midnight and now it fell over Ravenshire Manor like a judgment that refused to end, the sky pressing down upon the estate until even the windows seemed to breathe with sorrow. Inside the corridor where candlelight trembled like uncertain faith, Evelyn Ashcombe stood frozen between her husband and the man who had just entered their lives like a wound reopening. The stranger removed his hat slowly, revealing hair darkened by rain and eyes that carried the weight of unfinished history. Adrian Ravenshire stiffened as though memory itself had taken physical form before him. Evelyn felt the air shift as if the house itself recognized danger wearing human skin. "I thought you were gone," Adrian said quietly, his voice stripped of all ceremony. The visitor smiled faintly, though there was nothing kind in it. "Men like us are never gone, only delayed." Evelyn stepped forward despite the warning in Adrian's posture. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice steady but edged with fear. The man looked at her as though she were the answer to a question he had been asking for years. "I knew your husband before he learned to hide his conscience." The words landed softly but shattered something unseen between them. Adrian moved between them instantly, his presence no longer composed but fractured. "Do not speak here," he warned. But the stranger only stepped closer, rain dripping from his coat onto the marble like ink bleeding into paper. "You think silence erased what happened in that house 15 years ago?" Evelyn felt her breath catch. 15 years, she repeated under her breath. Adrian's jaw tightened as though restraint itself was breaking. "That name should never be spoken here," Adrian said. The stranger finally turned fully toward Evelyn, and in that moment she saw not a threat but a truth she had not been prepared to inherit. "Your husband was not the first Ravenshire to break a promise." Evelyn turned slowly toward Adrian, searching his face for denial but found only silence that confirmed everything. Rain struck the windows harder as if the world itself were listening. Adrian finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "You should not have come back." The stranger smiled again, this time with something like pity. "I did not come back for you, Adrian," he said. He turned once more toward Evelyn. "I came for her." Evelyn felt the floor beneath her steady itself as though preparing for collapse. "I do not understand," she said. But Adrian did not look at her, he was staring at the man as though he were facing a verdict. "Speak your purpose," Adrian demanded. The man stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I'm not here to destroy you. That would have been easier. I am here because what you buried is beginning to breathe again." Evelyn stepped back slightly as the meaning pressed into her understanding. "What was buried?" she asked. Adrian closed his eyes once, slowly, as though surrendering to inevitability. Then he spoke a name that neither of them had uttered in years. The air seemed to leave the corridor. Evelyn whispered, "That is impossible." The man shook his head gently. "Nothing about Ravenshire history is impossible, only inconvenient." Adrian finally moved toward Evelyn, his voice breaking through restraint. "Listen to me," he said. But she was already looking at him differently, not as a husband but as a man who had been hiding an entire life. Thunder cracked above the manor. The stranger turned toward the open doorway as if expecting someone else to arrive. And then Evelyn heard it. A second carriage door outside slammed. Footsteps approached through the rain-soaked courtyard, measured, deliberate. Adrian whispered no. Evelyn looked between them, her heart tightening as though recognizing the shape of a second betrayal. The stranger smiled faintly. "You thought I came alone." The corridor door behind him opened wider. A shadow of another figure stood outside the threshold. Evelyn stepped back until she felt the cold of the wall. Adrian moved instinctively, shielding her once more. The second figure spoke nothing, only lifted a gloved hand, revealing a sealed document marked with royal insignia. Evelyn felt her breath leave her. "What is that?" she whispered. Adrian did not answer. Instead he stared at the seal as though it contained the final ruin of everything he had ever tried to protect. The stranger stepped aside. "Let them see it," he said. Adrian shook his head once. "No," he said softly, too late. Evelyn reached forward before she understood why. The document slipped slightly in the rain-mist air. A crest shimmered on its surface, revealing a truth tied not only to Adrian but to Evelyn herself. Her name was written beneath the seal. Evelyn froze. Adrian finally spoke, his voice barely holding. "That is not possible," he said. The stranger answered quietly. "It already is." Evelyn looked down at the seal again as the rain thundered harder outside. And in that moment she understood that the 7 words she had heard in the library were not the beginning of her ruin but only the first door opening onto something far larger and far more dangerous than she had ever been allowed to imagine. Adrian reached for her hand but stopped halfway as though afraid that even touch might shatter what remained between them. The document trembled in Evelyn's grasp as the second figure watched in silence. Outside the manor, lightning split the sky, and for a fleeting moment the entire Ravenshire estate stood illuminated as though history itself had chosen to bear witness to what was about to be revealed next in their story. Evelyn tightened her grip on the sealed truth as Adrian finally looked at her, not as a duke, not as a husband, but as a man who feared that everything he had ever tried to protect was now standing in front of him, ready to collapse into truth that could no longer. The storm outside Ravenshire Manor did not ease when the sealed document was finally placed upon the table. Instead it seemed to tighten around the estate like a hand refusing to release its grip on truth. Evelyn Ashcombe stood motionless, her fingers still stained by rain from the parchment she had just held, her name burning in her mind like a confession she had never authored yet somehow now owned. Adrian Ravenshire remained between her and the strangers, though the line between protection and secrecy had begun to blur beyond recognition. The man from the rain stepped forward again, his voice quieter now but sharper in meaning. "That document was never meant to reach her hands tonight," he said, glancing at Adrian as though weighing old debts. "Yet here we are." Evelyn looked at Adrian, searching his face for denial, but found only a controlled stillness cracking at its edges. "What is it?" she demanded, forcing her voice to remain steady despite the tremor beneath it. Before Adrian could answer, the second figure, still half-shadowed in the doorway, raised the royal sealed paper slightly. It bore not only insignia but lineage. A name repeated across generations of power. And beneath it, in ink that seemed too deliberate to be accidental, was hers. Lady Evelyn Ashcombe. Except not as she had always known herself. "You are not who you were told you are," the stranger said. The words did not land as accusation but as revelation. Evelyn shook her head once, instinctively rejecting it, but her breath had already begun to fail her. Adrian finally spoke, his voice low and strained. "Do not do this here." But the man ignored him. "You think the Ravenshire tragedy ended with your marriage?" he asked Evelyn. "It began long before you were ever brought into this house." The room seemed to contract, candlelight flickering as though uncertain whom to believe. Evelyn stepped back, her heel catching the edge of the carpet, grounding her in something real as everything else shifted. Adrian moved closer to her then, no longer calculating, no longer distant, only human in a way she had never witnessed before. "Evelyn," he said softly, "I did not know they would come tonight." That was not an answer. It was a fracture. The stranger placed the document on the table between them as if laying down a verdict. "Your father was not who you believed either," he said. Evelyn froze. "My father died when I was a child," she replied. The man nodded. "That is what you were told." A silence followed so heavy it seemed to press against the bones of the house itself. Adrian's jaw tightened. "Enough," he warned. But the second figure finally stepped fully into the light, revealing a face marked by years rather than cruelty. "We are not your enemies, Lady Evelyn," he said. "We are the consequence of truths your marriage was built to conceal." Evelyn turned slowly toward Adrian. "Tell me this is not real," she whispered. For the first time since she had known him, Adrian did not immediately answer. Instead he looked at the document as though it were a door he had once locked and now found open. Outside, thunder cracked violently, and somewhere deep within the manor a clock struck midnight as though marking the death of certainty itself. The stranger spoke again, softer now. "The Duke knew fragments. Not all. That is why he feared you more than he ever admitted." "I never feared her," Adrian said sharply. The words were immediate, defensive, but unconvincing even to himself. The second figure shook his head. "You feared what loving her would reveal." Evelyn felt her vision blur at the edges. She looked at the document again, at her name written in ink that felt like ownership rather than identity. "What did you do?" she asked quietly, though the question was no longer directed at one man alone. Adrian finally stepped away from the threshold between them, his composure fully gone now. "I tried to protect you from a history that destroys everything it touches," he said, "and in doing so I became part of it." The stranger let out a faint breath, almost regretful. "There is no protection left," he said. "Only acknowledgement." Evelyn reached for the document again, her hand trembling, but before she could touch it, Adrian caught her wrist gently. "Not yet," he said. His voice broke slightly on the final word. The second figure turned toward the door as though sensing something approaching. Footsteps echoed again outside, slower this time, deliberate, too confident to belong to a messenger. The stranger exhaled once. "They have found us sooner than expected." Evelyn looked up sharply. "Oh," she demanded. No one answered immediately. Then the door at the end of the corridor began to open once more, not by force but by permission. And as it creaked inward, revealing the darkness beyond, Adrian whispered a name that made even the storm seem to pause. Another step entered the corridor and the candlelight bowed as if recognizing authority older than fear. A figure stood framed in the doorway wearing the insignia of the crown, rein on his shoulders yet no trace of haste in his manner. Adrian's voice broke as he repeated the name, this time aloud, and the sound carried the weight of a past he had spent his life trying to outrun. Evelyn stepped forward despite the warning in his eyes, drawn not by courage but by inevitability. The royal envoy studied her silently before speaking, confirming that the document was only the beginning of a summons that could not be refused. "Your existence has been recorded in matters that predate your birth," he said calmly. Evelyn felt the floor tilt beneath her as Adrian tightened his grip, no longer on secrecy but on her. Outside, the storm finally shifted direction, and the manor seemed to inhale as the truth prepared to finish what it had started. Everything changes now. The corridor of Ravenshire Manor seemed to narrow under the presence of the crown's envoy, as though the estate itself recognized a force it could not outvote. Evelyn Ashcombe stood between two truths now, the husband she had once believed she knew, and a past that had been written around her without her consent. The royal seal still trembled faintly in her hands, its wax imprint glinting like an accusation that refused to soften. Adrian Ravenshire had not released her wrist, though his grip had shifted from restraint to something closer to desperation. His composure, once unshakable in every drawing room of London, had collapsed into something far more human and therefore far more fragile. The envoy regarded them both with practiced stillness, the kind that belonged to men who delivered consequences rather than opinions. "You will come with us," the envoy said at last, his voice measured, almost indifferent, as though summoning nobility to judgment was a routine matter of weather. Evelyn turned her head slightly. "With you?" she repeated, though the question already felt answered. The stranger from the rain stepped forward again, but the envoy lifted a hand, stopping him without effort. "This matter no longer belongs to personal grievances," he said. "It belongs to the crown." At that word Adrian's expression tightened, not with surprise, but with recognition that felt older than the room itself. Evelyn noticed it immediately, the way his silence shifted from confusion into reluctant understanding. "You knew this would come," she whispered. "I knew pieces," Adrian replied, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Never all of them." The envoy approached the table and placed a second document beside the first. Unlike the first, this one bore no secrecy in its presentation. It was open, official, and final in tone. Evelyn hesitated before reading it, as though words alone might alter her identity further if she was not careful. When she did, the world did not break so much as realign. Her name was repeated again, but this time accompanied by lineage, authority, and a claim that reached beyond marriage, beyond scandal, beyond Ravenshire entirely. The air seemed to withdraw from her lungs. "You were registered under protection," the envoy continued. "A concealed lineage tied to political instability 15 years prior. You were never meant to be publicly acknowledged until the crown deemed it necessary." Evelyn lifted her gaze slowly. "I was a secret," she said, not as question but realization. "A safeguard," he corrected. Adrian finally released her wrist, as though the truth had made physical contact unnecessary. His hand fell to his side, but his eyes remained fixed on her face, searching for something that looked like forgiveness but dared not name itself. The stranger from the rain exhaled quietly. "And now the safeguard becomes leverage," he said. The envoy did not deny it. "Now she becomes relevant." Evelyn stepped back slightly, the weight of the revelation settling into her posture like stone. "Relevant to what?" A silence followed that felt deliberately constructed. Then the envoy answered. "Succession." The word struck the corridor with subtle violence. Adrian closed his eyes briefly, not in disbelief but in resignation. Evelyn felt something inside her shift, not into fear, but into clarity sharpened by betrayal. "You knew I was connected to this," she said to Adrian, her voice no longer trembling. "I knew you were being watched," he admitted. "I did not know why." The second figure finally spoke, his tone quieter now, stripped of confrontation. "The Ravenshire line was never as stable as history suggests. Your presence in this household was not coincidence. It was convergence." Evelyn laughed once, sharply, though there was no humor in it. "I was married into mystery without my consent." Adrian flinched at that, as though the sentence carried more weight than any accusation directed at him before. "Evelyn," he said, stepping toward her, "I tried to remove you from this before it reached you. And instead you buried me inside it," she replied. The envoy turned slightly toward Adrian. "Your household is implicated in concealment of royal interest. That alone warrants inquiry." At those words, Adrian straightened instinctively, the trained posture of a man accustomed to defending not emotion but legacy. "Then take me," he said immediately. Evelyn turned sharply. "No." The word cut through the corridor with unexpected force. Even the envoy paused. Adrian looked at her. "Evelyn, you do not decide that alone," she said. For the first time since the beginning of the storm, something in Adrian's expression softened. Not relief but recognition. She was no longer simply within the orbit of his choices. The silence that followed was not empty. It was waiting. Then Evelyn stepped forward, closer to the table where both documents lay. Her hands did not shake now. Instead, they steadied with the strange clarity that arrives only after devastation has finished pretending to be mercy. "If I am part of this," she said slowly, "then I will hear it fully. Not fragments. Not warnings. All of it." The envoy studied her for a long moment before nodding once. "Then you will come to Westminster at dawn." Adrian moved instinctively. "That is not safe." Evelyn turned toward him. "Nothing about my life has been safe since the library door closed behind me and I realized I was never given the full truth." The words landed with precision. Adrian did not argue further. The stranger from the rain stepped back toward the shadows of the corridor, his role seemingly complete, yet his expression carried something unresolved. "Truth rarely arrives alone," he said quietly. "It brings consequences with it." As the envoy prepared to leave, he paused at the threshold. "There is one more matter," he added. Evelyn looked up. "What now?" He glanced between her and Adrian. "The crown does not simply acknowledge hidden lineage. It assigns guardianship until verification is complete." Adrian's breath caught slightly. The envoy continued. "Until then, Lady Evelyn remains under the legal protection and restriction of Duke Adrian Ravenshire." The finality of it settled like iron. Evelyn turned toward Adrian slowly. "So I am still bound to you," she said softly. "Yes," Adrian answered, his voice almost inaudible. "But not in the way you think." The envoy departed without ceremony, leaving the corridor emptied of authority but not of consequence. The stranger followed moments later, vanishing into the rain without farewell. Only Evelyn and Adrian remained beneath the trembling candlelight. For a long moment neither spoke. The house itself seemed to wait. Finally Evelyn moved first, walking past him toward the library at the end of the corridor. Adrian followed silently, not as a duke now, but as a man stripped of every certainty he had ever used to define himself. Inside the library the air felt unchanged, yet everything within it had altered. Evelyn stopped near the center of the room, looking at the shelves that once held their quiet beginning and now seemed to contain their unraveling. "I thought I had lost you tonight," Adrian said finally. Evelyn did not turn. "You never had me," she replied softly. "Not fully." "That is what I have been trying to change," he said. She turned then, slowly, meeting his gaze with a steadiness that no longer came from obedience but from understanding. "Then stop trying to change me," she said. "Start telling me the truth as it arrives, not as you think I can survive it." Adrian nodded once, as though accepting a sentence rather than a suggestion. Outside, thunder faded into distance, as if even the storm had fulfilled its purpose. Evelyn walked to the center of the library and placed her hand upon the table where everything had once begun and ended and begun again. Adrian stood a few paces behind her, no longer leading, no longer hiding, only present. And for the first time since the library door had closed around a sentence that shattered her world, Evelyn realized the most dangerous truth was not what had been hidden from her, but what had always been waiting for her to choose whether to remain within its reach.